I am Jill, and I will have spoken or emailed or corresponded one way or another, I think, hopefully, with everybody in the room. But it's a real pleasure, as always, to be with you again, for many people, and to put faces to names and welcome you to this meeting for the first time, for those who are here for the first time. That said, I want to hand over to Seb to introduce Simon, who has a few words to say about a project he's been involved in here at the Dementia Research Centre and with Seb, and then we'll move on, as per the agenda, into the update on the Stages of PCA document. If there's anything throughout the day that needs clarification or sorting, then do come to myself or Mandy or any of the other people who stood up, and we'll fix it.
Thanks, Jill.
Thank you.
So, as Jill kindly mentioned, I'm Seb Crutch, I'm one of the psychologists. I just wanted to introduce you to a new friend and colleague called Simon Ball. And Simon and I got to know each other. Well, I actually didn't go on the speed date, but UCL arranged a competition to try and match up researchers with filmmakers to compete for a prize for some small pilot funding for a film or documentary about the particular research area of that researcher. And Keir, who many of you will know, went on this fantastic event where I think you literally went around 2 minutes with 20 different people.
Yeah, I think there was 20 filmmakers and 20 academics it was a speed networking event. But it's easy to get into. We've had such a fun time as well. And yeah, so I met about 20 different academics. It was quite intense, and at the end I had to choose sort of one or two because mixing and matching, but I got paired up with Keir. And at that time I knew very little about dementia, certainly less about PCA. But I think what drew me to it was the sort of amazing stories of people's, perhaps amazing is not the right word, but the sort of interesting stories of people's difficulty with spatial awareness. And I work with film, but perhaps I'm better described as an animator. So what I do is perhaps a bit more surreal and a bit more, a bit more surreal than just filming things. And a lot of the work I do involves changing and manipulating space. And I thought there was a really interesting connection between what I did and some of the stories and anecdotes that Seb told me about the experiences that people have with PCA. So
I suppose when we first met, the brief we gave to Simon, or the description we said, is that we've had lots of these meetings, that both the main PCA support group meetings and these carers meetings, where people have told us stories and experiences, particularly unusual visual experiences that people have had. And yet it's always difficult for those of us who don't have PCA, and particularly for the wider society, to understand exactly what the world must look like to someone with PCA. I mean, even for you as carers, I don't know if you find it easy or difficult to describe your partner's experience, but I know some people have used phrases like, oh, perhaps it's like looking at the world through a fractured mirror, through sort of broken glass, that sort of sense of fragmentation. And we have these phrases which are very evocative, but it's difficult to put it down on paper. And so that's where we thought it might be a good link up with Simon's great skills in animation to provide a slightly more sort of abstract way of visualizing and capturing people's experiences in order to try and communicate PCA to a wider audience. So we went for this competition.
Yep.
And the outcome was?
Well, we spent, we didn't get the funding. So that's it. I thought I'd just pop in and say hi. And yeah, we spent, what was it, about 2 months, not full time, but meeting up, and I began to sort of explore this field of research that Seb is embedded in, and we came up with first of all a written proposal and then a pitch, and so there was 20 filmmakers, and that was whittled down with proposals to 7 who pitched to a panel, sort of Dragon's Den style. There were 7 filmmakers paired up with academics, and there was a panel of judges who were from sort of eminent arts and film institutions who picked one pitch to be allocated funding, and we didn't get it, which was a shame. But 1 or 2 of the judges came up and said they really, really liked our proposal and thought that the connection between, the idea that we had of this connection between animation and perceptions, perceptual sort of issues that people have with PCA was a fantastic idea, and recommended sources of funding, in particular the Wellcome Trust. So we're already exploring different avenues. We feel like we've got good groundwork for an idea, and we're exploring different avenues of funding. And the other thing, I guess, is interesting to mention that a big part of the pitch was Seb and Jill's, this support group basically gave me as a filmmaker and them as researchers just access to lots of individuals who have experienced it. And any film that we make, we really wanted it to sort of come from the people that have experienced it. And for me, there were three elements to that. There were people who have been diagnosed with PCA, obviously, the scientists and researchers involved, but also the carers and the families that have been affected by it, and that's sort of this triangle of different characters. So, yeah, one of the joys of the project to me was being able to, the possibility of being able to come to these events and getting to meet people firsthand, which is, yeah, why I'm here.
Yeah. So Simon will be around over lunch.
Sorry to interrupt. People abroad are asking if you could move into shot.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that was probably me.
Both of us.
Yeah, both. Well,
Really?
You write this in different languages as well.
Hope it's a robust number.
Hello world.
Hello world. Yeah, so Simon will be around over lunchtime, so please do introduce yourselves and come and chat. But I think the long and the short of it is we're determined to do this.
Yes.
We haven't got this, it was only a small pot of money to prime the project, so there are lots of other places we can go. We've already sort of factored it into another grant that we're writing, and we determined that we find a way to enable Simon to tell some of the stories that have emerged from this group, because we think it's important not just to communicate to other people with PCA or who just received a diagnosis, but I think more generally this message that the dementias, even though clearly PCA shouldn't be labelled as such in the early stages, and Alzheimer's disease, it's not just about old people, it's not just about memory problems, it can affect people in very different ways at very different stages of life, and I think this is a message which Simon, I think, has got the real skills to try and capture. So please do talk to him. We'll not just today, but this is an ongoing relationship. If you have any particular experiences or stories you'd like to tell Simon, then please do get in touch with Jill or I, and we can always put you in touch directly. And yes, you'll see Simon around, I hope, for some time to come.
Great. Simon, thanks everyone.
Well, I know that a number of you were here last year when we discussed this for the first time, but for those of you who weren't here or who are attending for the first time today, this is really an attempt to try and address the question that lots of people very understandably pose when they receive a diagnosis of PCA or someone they know or love receives a diagnosis, which is not just what is it, but what will happen next. So that understandable question which doctors are atrocious at answering, which is how long will it be for me? How long will it be till I can or can't do this or that? And usually, as I said last year, usually you get, including from me, I'm afraid, some sort of hand-wavy answer of, oh, well, it's different for everybody, and we think on average this, but can be, and then give you some hugely varying figure in terms of time or so forth. And so what we wanted to try and capture was the experience of people involved in this group and more broadly about, for you, what were the order in which, what was the order and time course of the different challenges that you faced? And can we try to write a document which captures that so that for people who come to this having never heard of PCA, either with a diagnosis or with a relative with a diagnosis, they can get some sense of idea about what the future might hold. It's not a perfect plan, it's not a sort of diary that says on the 14th of January this will happen. It obviously, we all know that it can't be that precise, but it was wanting to try and group some of the experiences which happen early, in the middle, and later in the disease together, so that people might have a sense of what might happen, and also a language with which to communicate with one another and with other people about the level of difficulty or challenge that one's facing at the present time. So this was modelled on a previous piece of work by someone called Barry Reisberg, who for typical Alzheimer's disease published something called the 7 Stages of Alzheimer's Disease, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And in this, there was an attempt to divide the process of the disease course. I'm sorry to keep using that word disease, but I suppose this is, we could think of it as the journey of having, in his case, Alzheimer's disease, or in our case, PCA, into 7 stages, which were described and defined to some level of detail so that you could get a rough sense of where in that journey you were. And so these stages, as you can see on the screen, ranged from having no impairment, absolutely nothing wrong for you, for the person concerned, or for anybody else meeting them, through to the more serious and severe ends of the disease and the journey. And what we tried to do is essentially to translate that for people with PCA, because as we all know, the experiences of someone with typical Alzheimer's disease, particularly late onset Alzheimer's disease, and someone with PCA can be very different. But of course, it's a difficult thing to do, so there are lots of caveats around how concretely to interpret what we've tried to write. The first is an obvious point, but everyone's different. We try here to capture some sort of average or median of the different experiences we've been given. But as I'll show you at the end, we've also asked people to describe how well or how poorly the stages which we've described fit their particular experience, because we're not pretending that this is the exact time course for everybody. It might be that things happen in a different order for you, and that's fine. It doesn't mean you haven't got PCA. It doesn't mean that there's something else wrong. It's just that the disease evolves in different ways. Our brains are so complicated and different in health that when one gets a condition like PCA, it can affect you in very different ways. The definition of stages is obviously arbitrary. You go from being having no symptoms of PCA to quite a few challenges, and at what point do you say, oh well, that's one block of time, that's another block of time? And so these are words, and we hold them quite loosely, and we imagine that people might not feel, oh, on 13th of August, I moved from stage 2 to stage 3. It's not. We expect there to be much more overlap and continuity than that. The other thing is pace, and this is where it gets a bit more hand-wavy, is that, of course, some people we know have a condition which progresses more quickly for reasons we don't yet fully understand than other people, where things seem to move more slowly. And also, of course, we know that the change in symptoms, in experiences and difficulties isn't constant. For lots of people I know who've seen the draft version of this document to describe these sort of plateaus, and then it seems like things change very quickly and then it might plateau again. And so we know that it's not a purely sort of linear change that we're trying to describe here. And again, that's where you need to hold the terms a little bit lightly. The other thing to remember, of course, is that people find out that they've got PCA, or not even in some cases, at very different stages. There are some people who, by luck, chance, or having someone who's paying great attention to them, or have them having particularly good insight, notice that something's wrong very, very early. And other people for whom quite a lot of water's gone under the bridge by the time someone finally says to them, you've got PCA, I think. And so people will enter this scheme at different stages. It's not that everyone, when they get their diagnosis at stage 0 or stage 1, some people might not find out they've got PCA till what we would be talking about as sort of stage 4 or 5. So that's the other reason why it might not, if you've just been diagnosed, for example, not all of these stages might match your experience. Sorry, it is a long list of caveats. You don't have to read all these. I just wanted to sort of show all the ways in which this doesn't work before, I hope, showing you a few ways in which I think it's useful. I think we're obviously always talking about progressive change, but we equally don't want that to sound like a sort of nihilistic, very final loss of skills. There are lots of people who notice that for a while something becomes very difficult, and then either then that sort of change and decline halts and sort of plateaus, or sometimes people find other ways of doing things or other ways of enjoying certain experiences and activities, which means that they feel for a while that they've regained that particular skill. And so this is not to deny the reality of any of those experiences. I've mentioned about the language as well. Some of these words may sound a bit that's almost damning or accusatory, and they're not meant to be that. It's trying to map onto this language which already exists for describing the changes within typical Alzheimer's disease. I think the other couple of points highlighted in red here, that it's really important to know that there are sometimes, as I mentioned, this sort of apparent sudden changes, and we'll talk a little bit later on about whether that indicates that something really has suddenly gone wrong, or whether it's more that there's a sort of threshold, if you like, of abilities, and at some point people who've been struggling to continue to do a particular skill or task suddenly find that they can't do that. And certainly there's one comment in the individual descriptions later on where one family found that their father had, it felt like overnight, lost the ability to write. And they knew that this was a progressive condition, but nonetheless, that was the experience they had. It felt like overnight some vital skill or capacity had been lost, and how to describe and deal with that. And finally, again, we touched on this a little bit, but what we weren't quite sure with this scheme was how much to try and be really specific to PCA, but at the same time acknowledging that there's lots of overlap between conditions like PCA and Alzheimer's disease as well. So to take memory as one example, PCA is defined by having a really prominent visual or posterior cognitive deficit with relatively intact memory. But of course that varies. What does relative mean? For some people, their memory is certainly much better than mine, and I would argue absolutely flawless at the time when they're having visual problems. For other people, they've got quite a lot of visual problems, but their memory is not great either. And so with all of these sorts of words, then it may be that for some of the things in each stage, it might be that you really identify with some things, and other things you think, that's not me so much. So am I in that stage or not? There's a sense in which one has to, again, we've tried to capture the average, but every different person, I think, will agree more with some items than with others. That said, caveat. I thought if it's okay with you, what we're trying to do is to look through, and I'll just, as Malcolm said, to have a change of auditory experience. I'm just going to shut up for a minute and let you read each stage. And then really what would be helpful for us is if you would like to make any comments. So the stage we're at now is, we went through this process with a first draft last year. We took on board all the comments that were made at this equivalent meeting and redrafted the document to try and capture that. And then since then, about 20 people have very kindly gone through it with a sort of fine-tooth comb to say, yes, we agree with that particular experience, or yes, that happened, but not for us, but not till stage 4, or absolutely not, that's not right, or you've missed something. And so this is what we hope is a reasonably final draft of a document that we can put out there on the website and through other media to try and help people who, as I say, who are coming to this for the first time. But equally, it's a living document, and as I say, everyone's experience is different. So please do comment as we go through on particular experiences, whether this matches yours or not. And then just at the end, what I'd like to do is to highlight a couple of bits that we've significantly changed since the last time some of you will have seen this, and also to tackle the thorny issue of how you describe the last stage, because one of the key comments that we had was the first 6 stages are really nicely defined. I now feel I've got to pass stage 6. Does that mean it's about to be the end? And of course the answer is no, but trying to find a helpful but not too woolly way of describing how things can progress beyond that point and how long that might take when it can, again, be so variable to people is something I would really appreciate your advice on. I'm going to be quiet now. Feel free to read. So I suppose there's not a huge amount to comment here, just to mark that where we all start. Obviously, everyone's different, and different education, background, age, skills, etc. But at some point, everyone's been here. There's been a stage at which there's nothing to notice. So stage 2 is this. I don't know if there are speed readers in the audience or how to gauge when to carry on. And we'll leave it up there. Does anybody have any comments on that particular stage? So this horrible, disconcerting point at which maybe you sense something's wrong, but other people perhaps don't notice it, or it's difficult to describe what it is. Maybe there's some people whose partners are at that stage now, or who can remember this stage of is everything okay or not. There are lots of people who aren't sure whether to attribute the experience they're having to some prior event or to the ongoing change, and that's the horrible thing at this stage, is of not knowing. And as sort of patients and carers, as individual people affected with this in our everyday lives, we can also jump on similar explanations for when something started or whether there's a particular problem or something. Any other comments? Yeah, so knowing whether to amplify a particular problem or raise it with someone, or whether to think let's not mention it or just ignore. Yeah. There's a lot of uncertainty, yes. And I think because this condition is so insidious and progressive at this stage, it's not like there's a nice stepwise change and you can say, oh yeah, something's changed, something's different. And often it is that so many people come to us for the first time saying, the first thing I noticed was, and then go on to describe something incredibly complex they were doing. Like if you just think how complicated driving is, all the things you're monitoring and constantly making subtle adjustments. But for those of us without PCA, we don't even realise we're doing it in such an automatic process. Or other people who come to us, one gentleman I remember who came who was a surgeon. So he was doing something profoundly complicated, and he could still do it pretty much okay most of the time. But that's not something. But like with driving, that's not something where those small tolerances can be allowed. Whereas in other experience in everyday life, if you notice you're just marginally slower to put your toothpaste on your toothbrush, it wouldn't necessarily be something you would raise. So for some people, when they get diagnosed, is almost a sort of a product of chance of, have I run into the right kind of difficult situation where these problems become evident? For other people, they just don't, or they've got other people surrounding them and supporting them and helping them, that those things can quite reasonably be brushed under the carpet. In the interest of time, let's pop on to the next one. So this is stage 3, so feel free to have a read of that one. Right, this is a lengthy one, so I'm going to move on to a second screen. So apologies to those of you who haven't read all of that yet. Anybody, as we let people keep reading, anybody got any of the faster readers out there got any particular comments or queries about this one? Does that ring true to you, or are there things there so the comment there was about numbers and the experience of adding 4-digit numbers together and coming up with a 3-digit answer. So, yeah. And see, that's a really tricky one, because as a psychologist we test calculation skills all the time, but people vary so much. We all, all of us here would vary so much in terms of whether we're very good or very poor. And this is again it's this subtle judgment of, not that something's objectively wrong necessarily, but people are finding things just a little bit harder to do than they would have done previously. So some people would never have been able to do that sum, but for you that was a sign that something was on the slide. Yeah, absolutely. So this is the issue that we've talked about before. When you see someone in the early stages who recognises this as a neurological problem, or whether you're with people who think this is an eye-related problem, or one of the examples later on actually says that one person who was a bit older went to their GP, and the GP's conclusion was that this was a hysterical blindness, so not a sort of organic problem. And I'm not raising that to criticise GPs, because I think we have to realise how rare or unusual some of these presentations and difficulties are. But again, it's this chance that you might enter this scheme at different stages depending upon if you happen to come across someone who makes that link with the brain early enough. For those not with us in the rooms, this is this point about sometimes if you're younger when you go to your doctor, then it may be that things are recognised earlier as being difficult, but it also depends exactly what you're describing. So the example of being unable to write the word daddy is quite a significant change. It's a skill that most people really would expect you to be able to achieve. Whereas if you've gone with some other described problem that was more subtle, perhaps it wouldn't have been picked up or given the same weight of evidence. Yeah. Thank you. So this issue of sensory changes is one that attracted a little bit of Amelia. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, Amelia is the one who's very kindly spent a lot of time going through all of these different responses that we've had and updating and improving and amending the document. And Amelia, I don't know if you would like to comment, but I think sensory changes was one of the ones which caused a little bit of, there was variable experience. Some people had that earlier on, and other people didn't recognise that particular symptom.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people seem to agree that feeling a lot colder was quite a common thing to happen, or being more sensitive to the cold. But it was very divided on whether people felt that pain more or heat more, any of the other sensory disturbances. But cold was definitely quite unanimous.
Did people hear that at the back? So that was just about some of the sensory experiences are variable. Cold was one that people did, feeling more cold was one that lots of people recognised. But for other people, issues like excess sense of pain was felt by some people, but not by others. So it seemed that cold was one of the common ones there. So this is a good example of one of these variable symptoms. So I think the example here was of driving not in the centre of the lane, but to the left, and having difficulty with the clutch, and then knocking glasses over. And again, it's because I've knocked glasses over. Exactly. It's these. How do we weight that evidence as to knowing whether that really is a sign that something's wrong? And maybe it's the accumulation of several of these things, not just driving in a different position in the lane, as we've probably all done on holiday, for example. Yeah. But the addition of that, plus the clutch, plus the glasses, plus other things. Yeah. So finding words is again something which is very common. Even though we talk about PCA as being, well, lots of people talk about PCA as being a visual condition, there are lots of these additional things which are not obviously connected to vision, like finding the right word, like these sensory experiences, or knowing where your limbs are, which I think is possibly you could attribute that clutch use of the clutch problem. Right. So the question for those who couldn't hear it was, what can one do about these unusual sensory experiences? My repertoire of advice is pretty limited here. I'll maybe put it to the room first. For other people who've experienced these sorts of sensory changes, people feeling, for example, pain in their arm, have you found any particular ways of encouraging people to continue to do the task they're doing, like dressing, or of alleviating some of those pains? I know that some people have tried things like providing alternative sensory stimulation. So if you've got pain in one arm, using touch and stroking and things of another part of the body in order to, as a sort of distraction technique. But I know certainly not with universal success. I know that that's a really good idea. So do people hear that? So changing the clothing, so splitting clothes down the side and replacing them with popper buttons, so you could change, rather than expecting someone to be able to dress in the normal way, putting an arm through a sleeve, for example, adapting the clothes to suit them. Cardigans and button shirts rather than pullovers. Yeah, it's a great tip from a physio. If people didn't hear it, was if the arm becomes rigid or locked. Actually, sometimes there are parts of the body, like the elbow, which can be used to guide or promote a particular motion, like projecting your arm through a sleeve. That's great. So using these sort of heat packs to provide not just warmth, but perhaps also comfort if they have a more general effect. Yes. So the idea of using massage and other stimulation, absolutely. Very good.
I may have missed whilst I was out of the room, I don't know. So just the sort of, sometimes we miss the obvious, so kind of referrals to physiotherapists and occupational therapists for sort of assessment in terms of advice, movement advice, and also gadgets that can be provided to assist on a sort of practical level. And then just to make the point that if pain is felt and is experienced, then that in itself can massively compromise, obviously, the way in which somebody functions. So if there is an experience of pain, even if it sort of regards perhaps treatment with low-level painkillers in the first instance to see whether actually paracetamol can resolve, then that's not necessarily a bad idea. Sometimes I think you can perhaps address one area of pain by tackling a completely different part of the body. So a heat pack or a cool pack on your forehead, or a lavender scented something around your face, can actually sort of be a distraction that relieves to some degree the pain that you're experiencing in another part of your body. So sort of from the practical to the sort of alternative, the whole range you need to cover.
Thank you, Jill. That's really helpful. Mandy.
I think worth saying though, Jill, that a lot of physios and OTs are not going to be well versed in PCA. They've probably got transferable skills, so they've probably come across some of the symptoms before in different disorders. So, like your elbow thing, That might be as a result of somebody she's met with a stroke or something. So, you know, you might need to educate them as much as they will help you, you know, in order for them to help you.
And I think that's one of the unfortunate realities of, for those of you caring for someone who's got PCA, is that you have to be not just carer but educator as well, because it would be lovely if everybody did know about all the rarer conditions in the world, but we can't realistically expect everybody to. And I know that a lot of people, Jill's, I know, for example, done lots of work helping people who've got to go into a hospital or who are travelling abroad, or, you know, providing information which can be easily understood by the professionals and other people from different walks of life who you'll come into contact with, who need to understand something of PCA in order to do their normal role. Okay, let's pop on to the next slide. So stage 4. I'm afraid this is another 2-slider because of it all we added in comments. But, so as you can see, at this stage we're talking about quite a severe progression of some of the difficulties, but also still emphasising lots of retained skills. So I think the phrase which emerged at the equivalent meeting last year was this sort of a preserved sense of oneself, or a clear preserved sense of purpose. This is very different to somebody who I think the public might imagine as having moderate Alzheimer's disease, or someone who perhaps is more confused, who's beginning to lack insight into their own intentions and actions. This is a stage at which people know what they want to do, but are profoundly impaired in achieving it because of all the various different problems and challenges they're facing. So again, I guess the general question is, does this ring true, or are there things which diverge from your experience here? Absolutely. So just for those who perhaps couldn't hear, this was a very good point about how it's necessary not just to ask someone what their difficulties are, but to actually observe people and to see in their interactions with everyday life, where they live, with objects, etc., and with other people, whether they really can manage things that they were able to do. Because it's often, I mean, Simon and I, when I introduced Simon to someone with PCA and her husband last week, we had a good example of this, that we were asking this lady whether she could describe some of her visual experiences and spatial problems in particular. And we realised the lunacy in some ways of what we were asking as we were asking it. Some experience she was able to convey very well, but one good example is she was, her husband was relating the story about how she finds it very difficult to wash her hands, which seems like a really basic fundamental skill, but he said, well, she often puts her hands above the tap. And for someone who's never met someone with PCA before, that might not make much sense. But if you introspect about it for a moment, if your sense of space, not just the ability to see space, but even with your eyes closed to understand the very concepts of up and down, has become damaged, then how would you describe that to someone else? It's something like, just like you're saying, it's something you need to, the person assessing, if it's an OT or a social worker or someone, would need to see someone doing, because why would you expect someone to say, oh, I have difficulty knowing how high or low to put my hands? Because if you had that insight, you'd just do it. Does that make any sense? Yeah. And lots of these sort of frustrations that we don't have a very good vocabulary for describing some of these experiences that people with PCA go through. And even when we do have words for it, those words or their sort of deeper meaning might be lost or compromised in some way. Okay, so the question is, why is it so much harder to sit down than to stand up? I think it's an excellent question. I think because when you sit down, you've got to aim for somewhere. When you stand up, the only time you can't just stand up is if you're in a low room with a ceiling you might bang your head on. Does that make any sense? So often we have this experience of people who are able to give a beautiful history about knowing exactly what's going on in the world, Syria, Iraq, blah, blah, blah. And then you say, could you just take a seat? Obviously, meaning it as a bit of an observation test. And just seeing where, I don't need to tell you, you've all experienced this, just seeing how to orient the body towards the target seat. You've got to perceive what a chair is. When I look at this chair down here in front of me, I can immediately see my perceptual system tells me which way it's pointing, where the back is, where the front is, how low it is, how high it is. So I know all those targets, someone with PCA might not. But then I also know exactly, even with my eyes closed, I've got a sense of where my body is. We have what we call a proprioceptive sense, which means that my limbs know, I know where the position of each joint is relative to the other one. So I know if my arm's up or down, for example. And people with PCA lose that sense. This is, again, this thing about it not being purely visual. People lose that. I think this is one of the difficulty things, like getting dressed, putting your arm through a sleeve, sitting down on a chair becomes so difficult because the sheer sense of where your body is in space has been compromised. Whereas standing up, it's a simple motor act, sort of automated motor action. It doesn't require interaction with anything other than having your feet on the floor. But we're increasingly appreciating with hearing tales like this how balance itself, the pure sense of balance, can be affected in people with PCA. And often people are saying, "Oh, my husband," even once sat down, "my husband or wife is sat with their head in their lap or leaning off to one side," because again, you or I, our brains are able to interweave and connect our visual information, our sense of where our body is, and the inner ear sense of balance to create a knowledge of which way's up, which way's down, and that's not always the case. The other thing I'd say is also about confidence. I know we've all had that experience of trying to walk around, particularly someone else's house or a hotel room or something at night, and you kind of walk very slowly because you don't want to bang your toe on something, and you're not. And I remember it particularly when I went to the Dead Sea in Israel. You know, this highly salted water that you can float your body in. And I remember one of the funniest things I've ever seen was everyone else is just walking in, sitting down. It's a strange experience and people are cautious about it, but most people after a moment or two will just sit down. And I saw another lady who just didn't have that confidence. She stood probably for about 10 minutes by the edge of water, poised to sit down into the water, and she just didn't have the confidence that if she did what everyone else around her was doing, that she would be supported. And so I do wonder how much confidence, even with someone else telling me and saying it's okay, the chair's behind you, would I necessarily feel confident to make what's quite a large movement of my body, which might end up with me falling over. So for those who couldn't hear, this example was being able to take one sock off and then not necessarily being able to take the other sock off, maybe even putting the first sock back on. And there are we hear this quite commonly. It's a very similar story was one lady who was sat on the sofa with her daughter, and they both had their feet up on a cushion or table, and she could see that they were wiggling toes. And she said to her daughter, "Is it you wiggling your toes or me?" And for me, that just says there's such a disconnection between this visual information and what you're feeling about the world, that she didn't even know whether she was the one experiencing that sensation or those two didn't immediately connect. And I think if people begin to hear those sorts of experiences, this is some of the stuff Simon and I will be trying to capture in this film, then it sort of opens up a broader understanding of why people might find a whole host of other situations difficult. So I think we will, you're absolutely right, we will come on to talk about the reaction to these sorts of experiences, and it must be, I can't possibly, it'd be insulting for me to even pretend to be able to understand what it must feel like to be in that situation and what my reaction would be. I can't predict. So we'll talk about that. The hands and the sensation, I think, fits very much with the things we've been talking about, a loss of sensation, but also that experience you mentioned of the glass being taken out but still thinking one was holding it. I think again talks about the sort of inaccuracy of the brain's ability to appreciate not just the visual sense but the touch sense, the hearing sense and the smell sense and others. And also the fact that there are echoes of that in people, in other experiences we've heard of. For example, people often describing washes of colour or seeing colours which were present a moment ago, or the complement of colours that were present in their vision a moment ago but which are no longer present. The sense that some sensations run on in people with PCA sometimes. Our brains are all geared up to both fire cells to excite them, but then also to damp down that activity as well. Because if I hear something, I don't want to keep hearing it. I need to hear it once and then hear the next thing. So the brain is constantly pushing forward one particular message and then damping it down again. And I think in conditions like PCA, the damping down process sometimes doesn't work so well. So when that glass is removed, that signal is still remaining. It's not been damped down well enough. So she might genuinely feel like she's still holding the glass. So those experiences which are sort of more than what we would, it's not fabricating stuff, it's sort of having a even more pronounced perception of something that is there or was there than we might experience. Yeah. I think again one can relate this to this broader sense of space. So just as we've been saying, PCA is not just about vision. If you were to ask me that, can you blindfolded go into my kitchen and get out a spoon? But I can still do that because I can close my eyes and I've got a mental image of where the different cupboards in my kitchen are, or in your case, where the utility room is relative to the kitchen or the dining room or the hall or whatever. And in people with PCA, it's not just your explicit vision of what's around you, it's your vision for those stored mental images, which is also difficult to appreciate. And that's why describing that in words like where is it in the utility room may be difficult to interpret. It's not that the utility room makes no sense. I'm sure your wife would still be able to say a utility room is the kind of place where you store stuff you don't use all the time, or it might have a sink in it or whatever. It's not that the word means nothing, but the sense of where it is, at the very least, I'm sure is effective. The point about having the opportunity to speak to someone independent of the person with the problem you're describing, I think is, really, it should be medicine 101, and it should be an opportunity that everyone is offered. Not just because you've got to betray some sort of confidence, but actually it's helpful often for the person with PCA or whatever other condition themselves to be able to speak without their other partner there as well. I think those apparent inconsistencies, it's interesting when you say that to me, because I've had the privilege of working with lots of people who describe experiences like that. That doesn't strike me as being a paradox or an inconsistency. I kind of have a sense of why that is. So we know that people with PCA often perceive a bit of the world, but not the whole picture. So whereas you or I might be distracted by the fact that we're aware of what's going on over here, sometimes people hone in on a particular detail, and it gives the impression that they've actually got better vision than you or I. And actually, I think it's just a small benefit to having a different problem with another aspect.
I think what really came out of that last session, though, especially, is the fact that whilst the sensory sort of deficits obviously are very, very real, as important is how we address those in the environment and the sort of approach that we adopt in terms of interacting with somebody with PCA or any of the other sort of diagnoses. So I think they're almost equal in terms of where we need input and learning and teaching. So without further ado, I think we'll continue from where we left off.
So I think the only thing I'd add to that is we'll talk about these last so-called described stages, but what I'm keenly aware of is that in the morning session we talk quite a lot about practicalities, about perceptual experiences in not a cold manner, but in quite a sort of precise, slightly scientific way. And obviously there's a huge component to this is what is our reaction to these experiences, and particularly the reactions of the people you're looking after and caring for, and your own reactions. So please don't feel shy that the list of stages is a attempted description in quite stark, concrete terms of what you might observe, but of course can't capture one's reaction to that and the emotions that go with it. So please don't be shy of offering comments on that aspect of things. So I'll be quiet again for a moment and just let you read again. This stage is poured out over a couple of slides, so we'll just have a moment to look at this. Let's move on to the next slide. So I don't know if anybody would like to set the ball rolling by offering any observations or reflections. Yes, that's a very interesting point. So the point at which one stops holding hands sort of spontaneously, do you mean? So I mean, I can think of the boring reasons we talked about earlier in terms of loss of sensation and things, but I think that more sort of emotive quality of having the personal urge to comfort someone else or to interact with someone else through touch. And other people experience that. So I think it's an interesting the area of hearing because it's something which crops up in the comments as Amelia was going through, I think, where there's mixed opinion about this. Some people saying that the sense of hearing was lost or reduced, other people saying it was heightened or more sensitive, and other people just describing not a loss or a gain, but just that in some situations it was difficult to appreciate sounds, a difficulty focusing in on perhaps one conversation when there's lots of other conversations going on around. So I think there is that issue of sort of focus of being able to tune in. But your point about the tone of voice is very important, about the manner in which one is greeted, particularly if for lots of us, we take for granted that when we meet someone, if they smile at us, it sort of gives us
Yes.
reassurance or an expectation that they're about to be warm and sympathetic, or not, as the case may be. But if you don't have that pre message. Sorry, it was a comment about Mandy was describing. She felt she used to make the mistake of holding her hand out to someone with PCA, because that's our common greeting, of course, not very appropriate or helpful for someone with PCA. And that's exactly the sort of thing when you introduce, I imagine, but certainly when I've introduced people with PCA to other colleagues or friends or whoever, that it's a shame when you get off on the wrong foot, because that very first interaction is awkward, and people know the person who doesn't know anything about PCA doesn't understand why their hand isn't being shaken. The person with PCA knows that there's some sort of awkward pause, even if they can't see the hand, and it's kind of things get off on the wrong foot. So I think those small, subtle touches, I think, are really important.
For sure, I think we do talk about a grasp reflex, and that can be quite difficult to negotiate around. And I think with the question about holding hands comes into the whole kind of social context question. So the whole, Seb was alluding to, the cues that you're picking up and the quite complex processing that goes on in terms of wanting to affectionately hold somebody's hand to convey a message of love or support. It's quite a complex process to think through and execute, and perhaps the difficulties lie in that processing as much as and including the physical sort of activity of the hand holding itself. Not just in that case, but across the board of emotional engagement and sort of apathy that we see quite typically and commonly throughout sort of later stages of most dementia diagnoses, can have a very significant effect on people's perceived willingness to respond to what you and I would consider the cues of love, care and affection. And I think they're very difficult cues to not respond to, because as carers and as human beings, we so depend on those cues being met in order to facilitate our ongoing sort of reciprocation of that love, care and affection. So it's a very important kind of concept, I think, to get our mind around when we're trying to embrace the care needs as well as the physical needs.
So it's a very good question. And it's something that Rachel and her colleagues at Brunel University are looking at in this what we call Seeing What They See project,
Yes.
which is not just about the sort of psychology of PCA, but about the wider effect on one's life and the effect of one's loved ones. A very key part of that is working with people who have the social science background and expertise to be able to analyse conversation and interactions, to say what is the impact of PCA upon one's life. How is it different to typical Alzheimer's disease, for example? How much of that is the vision thing, or how much of it is a general experience of a loss of function, a loss of skills, and all the destruction of relationships and activities that brings? So I think we don't know the answer yet, but I think we're now linked in with people who really have those skills to be able to pick out the fine detail of conversation and interaction to get us a handle on that.
It's perhaps worth drawing out the difference, although there are similarities in what we hear. There's perhaps a different process in place with your 2.5-year-old grandson who's accumulating semantic knowledge and learning.
Yes.
So the question was about whether sometimes people might hear things which haven't been said, or hear things that aren't there. And my guess would be, I'm not an expert by any means on sound and how the brain hears. Mm-hmm. But we have colleagues in the department who are, and their work is increasingly showing that even in what we would call a visual condition like PCA, actually hearing is off the boil very early on, in subtle and perhaps unprecedented ways or unexpected ways. And I think just as people may sometimes with PCA may sometimes see an object that we would perceive clearly, and misperceive it as something else. I think similarly with sounds, one might hear a fragment of a sound or mislocalize something that's outside the house, which we would not even contemplate because we automatically classify it as being an outside or not a sound that's going to bother us or interact with us, as being something which is more personal or relevant or something else. I don't know, I'm speculating, but
likewise I am, but in terms of the thoughts that are often in our head, that we sometimes respond to verbally.
Yes, right.
I'm sure there's that complex science behind this, hearing and listening. Absolutely.
I think the hearing example you gave of hearing one thing that seems pleasant or being distracted, profoundly distracted by something else is, I think, very similar to the topic that someone mentioned earlier of seeing movement, perhaps with you as well, of some motion, the movement of dolphins being distracted, which other people didn't notice. And again, you see this parallel between the different senses, not just a visual thing. I know Simon will be pricking up his ears. Quite rightly and wisely said to me that film is at least 50% audio. So we think of it as a visual medium, but the sound's just as important. So thank you. So with all of these things, with all of these descriptions, they're not holistic. You don't have to tick every single box in order for it to perhaps potentially be a useful label. So just in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next stage. The next stage really is where we get a bit more, I was going to say cloudy, maybe that's not helpful, but there's a bit more of a sense of merger with some of the experience that people with PCA have with experiences that you'll hear described by people with typical Alzheimer's disease and their carers. There's a sense that there's a gradual coming together. Not for everybody, but for some people there may be things here which might be more recognised by people not just with PCA but with other forms of degenerative disease as well. I don't know if people have had a chance to digest some of those. I mean, just feel free to comment on anything, but I think in particular perhaps if we think about the behaviour and the personality change, just because that's one of the things which we haven't touched on so much, or the reaction to experiences. A lot of people would have those. Do people know what this is referring to? There's this sense of some sort of motor change, where there are flicks and jerks and unusual movements sometimes come in. So some people with myoclonus or myoclonic jerks. That's something which the Brunel team, which I mentioned earlier, are very much on at the moment. They're going to a number of different key professional groups, like occupational therapists, opticians, ophthalmologists, to assess how much is known, how much conditions like PCA are taught about and trained about in the development of people within those professional groups, doing little focus groups with groups of people within those professions to say how much do you know about it, how much have you heard about it, what form of information would be useful, when did you need to know about this in order to improve your practice. I think we know that in people with all forms of degenerative disease, but certainly including PCA, that the loss of the ability to retrieve skills is one of the particular brain skills which can be lost even in a subtle way quite early in the condition. But I think what a lot of us retain is that urge to communicate. And so even when we don't have the precise tools, the precise words to do it eloquently, still the urge to communicate something or to connect with people in some way drives us to continue to create sound. And things like singing are sort of quite, I don't want to bore you with the sort of neurology of it, but quite sort of deep and ingrained within us. And there are a lot of examples of people who can both enjoy and also produce singing at a stage where spontaneous speech, a sort of a spontaneous creation of linked words, is impossible, but going back into a well-learned tune where they sort of know it as a whole unit can still be enjoyable for them and very expressive. So I think that's a common and important experience. I don't know for sure, but my guess from when I've tried to speak a foreign language and I've tried to communicate as well as I can, albeit for a different reason I'm struggling, I suspect there are lots, I don't know about in every situation, but yes, I would guess that a lot of people think they are communicating because the intention might be preserved, even if the output isn't as intact as it could be. I don't know if people have heard all of that, but yes, there are certainly, you were commenting on a stage at which almost all sounds were repeated, and that's something we hear in a variety of different conditions, but yeah, sometimes in PCA as well. I don't think we have included that on an earlier stage because that's something that again, it's very variable. Right. But because we've got the experience that there are some people with PCA who even way into the disease, completely unable to see anything and have profound difficulties and yet retain that clear sense of themselves. I think that's something which we haven't emphasised. And again, partly it's not to deny that that might happen in an individual person, but that we tried to hold back the things which might be shared or particularly seen in another condition. So there's a condition called frontotemporal dementia, where one of the main symptoms, early symptoms, is loss of empathy. And so had we included it too early in this section, it might have confused people as to the condition we were talking about.
I think they're picking up on that, and certainly in reference to the point Mary made about language and not being able to understand and possibly a message trying to be conveyed. There's a whole other area there, I think, that it would be wise to address in a separate session more fully, but just to comment on it today, and that is how that makes you feel, obviously, as the sort of carer or sort of conversationalist alongside somebody who you can't understand the message of, and sort of techniques and hints and tips for sort of reassuring messages of sort of security to that person, despite the fact you can't understand the message they're trying to give. So whether that's by touch or by music or by the tone of your voice or any other gesture, or sort of any of the other senses that come into it, I think it would be worth looking at again. But it's just to make the point that I think it's easy to dismiss it in a sentence or with a response and an answer, but it's a huge sort of aspect in terms of that relationship and the burden and the caregiving relationship. So it's a huge issue that you raise there, not to dismiss it at all by an answer. I think not just mother-daughter though either, is it? Husband, wife, daughter, mother, son, on all levels there's a massive sort of change in the role relationship that's involved.
Okay, well, just again, in the interest of time, move on to stage 7. I think the question really here is, a number of people said, ooh, if I'm at stage 7, does that mean I'm at the end? If you've got stages 1 to 7 and I think I'm more severe than 6, does that mean things are going to change, rapid changes are going to happen to me imminently? And I think this is almost about a sort of difficult question about how to wrap up this description of stages. Is if you number them, of course you've got to have a final number. It's a bit like, I think, is it A-level grades or GCSEs? They're now going to be graded 1 to 9. At some point, do you put a 10 in? And so one of the comments that we had back from this was, shouldn't we have 7A and 7B, which I think we could do, but I think it's, even if we don't call it 7A and 7B, I think the question is absolutely right about how do you describe that period that comes after the stages we've looked at already, where it might be very rapid, it might be, as I know some people have had the experience of here, a very lengthy process of gradually more and more things becoming difficult and more significant physical and personal care being required. So that's just something to reflect on as you're reading this one. So I know this sort of stuff is very difficult to read for a lot of people here, so I'm aware this is a sensitive issue. Absolutely. So the question was, have we tried to measure how long people are in each of these stages? And it's an excellent question. So yes, that was part of the feedback that we asked people to provide. So about the 20 people who provided, Amelia's gone through. And obviously these things are very difficult when asked retrospectively to say which year were you at this stage, which year were you at this stage. But from people's best estimates, Amelia's managed to calculate a sort of average duration of each stage. And obviously some people who've responded have only been a variable or short distance through that journey. And so a real picture will require us to invest energy in this longer term and see a number of people through the whole journey of PCA. And so we don't have a precise answer. I don't know if you can remember the numbers.
The average, from the responses we have, and not a lot of people felt they'd reached the final stages. So the average from the beginning to the final stage we've listed is quite rough because there's less responses. But the average we've got is around 9 years.
So an average of 9 years up to stage 7.
Yeah, around them.
Yeah. I seem to remember when we looked at the numbers, it was on average 1.5 to 2 years per stage. But of course, not everybody is this a sort of linear thing. Some people would feel they've got to stage 5 very quickly and then remain there for 4 years, for example.
Absolutely.
So it's a very good question. So it hasn't been looked at in detail in PCA because the detailed research into PCA is a relatively recent venture. In in the realm of typical Alzheimer's disease, where there are large epidemiological studies, people have been able to address those issues more clearly. But it's still a hot topic. So, for example, as you know, here we work a lot with people who get Alzheimer's disease and dementias earlier in life. And so the simple question of, does the disease move faster if you get it when you're 45 than when you're 75? Even that very fundamental question, people I still don't think have a clear answer to. And it's largely because there's so much variability. Some people having a disease course of 5 years, some people 20 years. And it's because it's that variable, the estimates of what are the critical factors are very mixed. What we do know is that your general well-being, your likelihood to get dementia, and to some extent your likelihood to progress through a course of dementia rapidly, are partly determined by all of the things that your GP has been telling all of us to do for ages. So keep your blood pressure down, don't have too much high cholesterol level, don't smoke, don't drink too much, etc. But I think there's no one magic ingredient that predicts, even strongly predicts, the rate at which things will progress, I'm afraid. I know it's a really irritating answer, but so you're feeling that, sorry, just for those who couldn't hear, so that your husband's been on a plateau for a couple of years, but that swallowing, you expect, might be a really key point in that journey when changing to a different sort of stage or situation.
Yeah, but absolutely, it usually is. And swallowing brings about problems, brings about their own difficulties in terms of chest infections and not being able to take on enough food and fluid and that sort of thing. So that usually signifies the shift to another stage, for sure.
And that stage, I think I'm right to say, Mandy, is kind of common perhaps to most end of life sort of stages, regardless of the diagnosis that led you to that stage. There is a common set of symptoms to some degree that you would expect in that end of life stage.
And I think that's one reason for which we haven't tried to go into too much detail with this, because if we did, and this whole thing is labelled the stages of PCA, it might infer that in some ways it was very significantly different to this stage in Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia or vascular dementia or any of these other conditions. And I think probably what we need to do is to signpost people from here to other documents or descriptions which more clearly describe the care and the drivers of different needs of care in those last months and years.
Indeed, yes. I think obviously we're inevitably led into sort of a difficult place right now, but I think it's wise to just open the floor for the last 5 minutes to questions of another nature. If people have got questions generally that they'd like to throw into the audience, before we sort of wrap up with a conclusion and sort of closing remarks. So if there are anything sort of from other aspects.
I might draw my colleague who I can see through the open door, the corridor. I think many of you will know my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Schott. John, do you want to answer a question about hereditary loss?
Welcome everybody. About 1% of Alzheimer's disease is inherited in a truly genetic fashion, so it goes from generation to generation, and if someone's affected, their children have a 50% chance of being affected. That typically is patients who are very young onset and have prominent memory problems. In terms of PCA, as far as we're aware, there's one report in the literature of this occurring in one particular family only, and we're somewhat dubious about that. And certainly in our experience of seeing well over 100 patients here, we've not found anybody who's got one of the mutations in one of the genes that causes Alzheimer's disease. There's another question which is about the genetic makeup that might predispose you to developing Alzheimer's disease, cortical atrophy. And if only 1% of the disease is caused by a gene, like most complex diseases like cardiovascular disease, strokes, there are a lot of genetic risk factors. This area has expanded hugely in the last few years in Alzheimer's disease, and we've gone from one genetic risk factor to about 20 through huge international collaboration. So we now know there's lots of these aren't things that we would test for because they're all very minor, and actually they're most useful in allowing us to understand the pathways that lead to Alzheimer's disease. We are just completing a large body of work doing an international study of individuals with PCA to see how those risk factors play out in PCA. Of course, it's a relatively rare disease, so we've had to go to about 10 international centres. So we've got DNA samples from individuals from the States, France, from Germany, various other countries, and we're looking at those now. It's too early to say, but we think that the risk pattern is somewhat different in PCA of the ones that we've looked at, and we're going to go on and see if we can find some new risk genes. But I don't think, we think that we're going to find genes that cause the disease.
Do you just have, well, we can speak up later on about other sort of family history, but generally when talking about a directly inherited form of Alzheimer's disease, there are different measures of how strong that genetic link is, but usually people are looking for someone who's presenting with these symptoms to have at least 2 relatives in a previous generation who've shown a similar pattern at a similar time. I mean, it varies.
And one of the issues about Alzheimer's disease, I mean, PCA, we're considering as a variant of Alzheimer's disease and somewhat separate. But if you consider that if you live to the age of 90, you have a 1 in 3 chance of having Alzheimer's disease. For a start, it means that almost certainly must be some genetic risk factors, but also there's some protective factors. But also, it's highly likely that most people, not most people, but a large number of people will have first-degree relatives. So, in terms of the familial forms, these are the people who often come in, and one of my patients who's not got PCA but more typical Alzheimer's disease, who came to see me saying, some Alzheimer's disease in my family, and proceeded to unroll a family tree going back to 1780, and you can see. So that's the sorts of patients that we have been studied, and we've got different research programs and different treatment trials ongoing in those individuals as well. But not presenting with PCA as far as we know.
Yes, so the simple and most important answer to your question is, as far as we know, we've never felt the need to strongly reassure anybody about a familial risk, because it's vanishingly rare if it happens at all. And so I think if you've got PCA, it's very unlikely that there's any substantial risk to your children. So the study that John described, the genetic study, is asking, why does one disease, Alzheimer's disease, affect the memory centres of the brain in one person, which are down here, and affect the visual centres at the back of the brain in somebody else?
In the time, I think it's right and proper that we sort of wrap things up in terms of the meeting per se. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for your contributions that made the document possible at all, and Seb and Amelia in terms of kind of compiling results and getting today's presentation ready. So thank you very much. And special thanks to Seb for kind of hosting the entire session. So I think it was very timely for Dr. Schott to make his appearance, because he actually is the speaker at our November meeting. So we had a little sneak preview of him and sort of what he'll have to say. And otherwise, I think it just goes without sort of saying, for me, obviously, to kind of thank you all for attending. I hope that what you take away from today is helpful. I know there'll be parts of what's been discussed today that will be hard and heavy, but I hope that on balance, it's been a positive experience, and that you will join us again for another meeting. And I think, yeah, just to thank you for your participation and to wish you a safe journey home. And obviously, if there's any feedback at all or anything you want following up from this meeting, do email me. And
is the next meeting here?
No, it's not. The next meeting, in fact, I've just had an email.
Right.
We won't go there. No, the venue for the next meeting
UCL.
is UCL as it stands. So yes, and that will all be up on the website, and we'll circulate it accordingly. So
can I just thank Jill and all the management for looking after us so well. It's lovely refreshment.